Hello, and welcome to day 2 of Consent Not to Be a Single Being, Worlding Through the Caribbean, organized by the Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational in collaboration with the Transnational and Transcultural Art and Cultural Exchange, or the TRACE Network, and the University of the Arts London. My name is Ming Tiempo, and I am a professor of art history at Carleton University, where I'm co-director of the Center for Transnational Cultural Analysis. I'm also co-lead with Paul Goodwin of the Worlding Public Cultures Project, which is a research project of TRACE, funded by the Transatlantic Platform. I would like to begin by thanking the Tate, and in particular, Soo-Kyung Lee, Francis Morris, Odessa Warren, Emma Jones, and the Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational for their ongoing collaboration, sustained dialogue, and support of the Worlding Public Cultures project. The generosity with which the Tate holds space for discourses and collaborations, such as this one, enables a sharing of resources, platforms, ideas, and networks across sectors, disciplines, and scales of practice that is critical for developing resilient public cultures, which is more important than ever in our current moment. We are delighted to be collaborating on this conference with them and to be in dialogue with Life Between Islands, Caribbean British Art 1950s to Now, curated by David A. Bailey and Alex Farquharson. Worlding Public Cultures is an international, interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral research network that is engaged in collaboratively creating new cultural and social frameworks for art and culture in a globally entangled world. Critically deploying the notion of worlding as an activating concept, as has been elaborated and nuanced by thinkers such as Gayatri Chakravarti-Spivak, Peng Che, Sarah Hunt, but also Martin Heidegger, it proposes worlding, or what we define as the situatedness of world making, as an activating concept and analytical tool that enables the emergence of a world of many worlds, as articulated by Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blaser. Worlding Public Cultures is a critical collective that aims to develop imaginaries that go beyond top-down models of inclusion, diversity, and other representations of the global. In other words, as our brilliant keynote speaker, Catherine McStrick, outlined with respect to her own work yesterday, WPC, or Worlding Public Cultures, rejects description that maintains existing epistemologies and seeks instead to define new methods of praxis from multiple situated perspectives through research, pedagogies, curatorial work, and creative practice. This conference, which represents part of the third WPC gathering, the first two having taken place in Ottawa and in Amsterdam, takes the Caribbean not as a geography, but as method to think through the possibilities of radical pluriversality, multiple epistemologies, histories, and temporalities, as well as their entanglements. Three thinkers, Édouard Glissant, Stuart Hall, and Sylvia Wynter, serve as our guiding lights to reimagine globality and new ways of imagining, being, and living together through and with the Caribbean and its constitutive multiplicity. Taking Glissant's phrase, consent not to be a single being, as inspiration and starting point, therefore, this conference seeks to reimagine a radical planetary humanism that is pluriversal. The conference is being recorded, and within a few weeks, you can catch up on parts of it that you missed on the brand new Worlding Public Cultures website, which is at www.worldingcultures.org, which I will put into the chat shortly. Additionally, alongside the conference this week, the WPC London team is excited to present a program of artists' audio and film work on the WPC website, curated by Rahila Haq. The entire program for the conference can be accessed on the Tate website, which I will also put in the chat later. Our panel today, this panel on Counter Histories, is a critical piece of that articulation, of the articulation of consent not to be a single being, of that pluriversality, in that it challenges existing histories of oppression, such as the Holocaust, plantation narratives, and primitivism, and provides counter histories that complicate and decolonize those narratives. Together, the papers mount epistemological challenges to existing categories of race, artistic terminologies, language, and identities, and ask critical questions about how our disciplinary fields are constituted. We will have 3 papers today, as Winnie Tiao is unfortunately unable to join her due to strike action in response to declining pay and precarious conditions at UK universities. We stand in solidarity with Winnie and with the strike. Our first paper is by Adrian Rooney, a PhD candidate in art history at Rice University, who studies 20th century art and visual cultures in the Americas with a focus on the Caribbean and the United States. Her paper today is drawn from her dissertation in progress, which examines the Caribbean Festival of Arts, or Carafesta, and its first 4 iterations in Guyana, Jamaica, Cuba, and Barbados. Rooney has published in many journals and is co-founder of the Racial Geography Project at Rice University. Her paper is entitled Resurrect These Images, Envisioning the Caribbean Festival of Arts, Carafesta, 1966 to 70. Please don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A box below for discussion, which will take place after all 3 papers. And with that, I cede the floor to Adrienne.
Resurrect These Images, Envisioning the Caribbean Festival of Arts, Carafesta, 1966 to 70. When the writers and artists tasked with dreaming up a Caribbean arts festival for the region's 20th century post-independence era recommended that it represent, quote, our multilingual Caribbean plantation culture, end quote, they ruptured some of the most profound tenets of colonial logic. Carafesta, the ongoing festival born from their recommendations, would unfold over the course of the long, heady 1970s in Guyana, Jamaica, Cuba, and Barbados. The festival's first years, after which it went dormant for a decade, are the focus of my dissertation. However, today I will sit with the phrase I began with, a phrase penned in the unofficial report of the 1970 gathering from which the festival emerged. Though but 5 words in an extended history, when read within the context of co-evolving thought of Caribbean economist Lloyd Best and George Beckford and cultural theorist Sylvia Wynter, the phrase multilingual Caribbean plantation culture, I argue, becomes potent and expansive, revealing the magnitude built into the festival by the artists and writers who envisioned its shape. The illustrious list of thinkers that conceptualized Carafesta came primarily from the Anglophone Caribbean and its diaspora. They had been tapped as delegates for the second of 2 Caribbean writers and artists conventions in Georgetown, Guyana, called by the newly independent nation's Prime Minister, Forbes Burnham. Among them were Barbadian or Bayesian poet and historian Kamal Brathwaite and Jamaican artist Carl Parbusing, who arrived from Jamaica, Guyanese painter Aubrey Williams, who flew in from London, as did publisher John LaRose and novelist and broadcaster Andrew Salkey. Many of those in the room that February of 1970 were part of a vital ecosystem of thought comprised of an overlapping, expansive group of artists, writers, and scholars associated with the Caribbean arts movement originating in the UK, its journal, Savaku, and the New World Group based in Guyana and Jamaica. Neither Best nor Beckford nor Wynter were delegates, though they were part of this ecosystem, and their writings from this period revealed the implications and potentiality of dreaming a festival representing a multilingual Caribbean plantation culture. A festival that, I argue in my broader project, was paradoxically at once a space of heterochronic redress and cultural diplomacy. Indeed, as one participant rightly wrote, quote, the neocolonialists are learning to use culture as a political weapon, end quote. But Carafesta wasn't only that. Lloyd Best and George Beckford were key theoreticians of the New World Group, a consortium born in the early 1960s of economists, political, and social scientists conceptualizing how to improve life in the Caribbean by looking to its own thinkers and patterns. They developed a central premise that the plantation system shaped and continues to shape the region, encompassing locations marked by, as Best put it, quote, the cultural, social, political, and economic foundations of the sugar plantation variant of the colonial mind, end quote. For Best, this includes the Caribbean islands and the Guyanas, as well as the Carolinas, Paramaribo, Caracas, and Recife, among the many other locales where the colonial plantation reigned, and that, moreover, continued to be beset by increasing inequality and continued dependence on colonial or former colonial powers. In sum, as Sylvia Wynter put it, the group conceptualized the plantation as the starting point of not simply the Caribbean past and present, but the modern world. And this logic undergirded its argument that socioeconomic inequality in the Caribbean was grounded in not only economic dependency along the lines of the colonial plantation system and upheld by multinational corporations in the present, but also in cultural and epistemic dependency along those same transatlantic and increasingly global lines. Knowing that many of those in the room at the 1970 convention were well acquainted with Best and Beckford, the phrase multilingual Caribbean plantation culture thus takes on layered significance. Most candidly, it crosses colonially rooted language and cultural divides in and around the Caribbean Sea, areas shaped to different degrees by the plantation system. Moreover, it advocates for cultural independence from current or former colonial powers and their contemporary manifestations. That is, it calls for locating culture not in the metropole, for which the plantation and what Jarvis McInnes calls its afterlife were peripheral, but in a shared circum-Caribbean center. If for the New World group, culture and thought were imported from colonial and neo-colonial metropoles, Caribbean humanists and artists researching the cultural lives of the enslaved showed that there were long-standing cultures and epistemologies from elsewhere in their midst. Among these researchers were colleagues Kamau Brathwaite, to whom I return, and Sylvia Wynter. Wynter, although not part of the 1970 convention, was perhaps there in thought and would eventually present her work at Carafesta, including the play that evolved from the now seminal text I will focus on today, John Canoe in Jamaica, towards the interpretation of folk dance as a cultural process, published in Jamaica Journal on the heels of the convention in June 1970. Titled after an African-derived religio-cultural festival, the essay is, I argue, a productive way to frame the conceptualization of Carafesta and the phrase multilingual Caribbean plantation culture as it concurrently developed what David Scott calls not only a Jamaican, but a general theory of Caribbean cultural process, one rooted not in recent but centuries-old processes within the plantation matrix. To form her theory, Wynter established two terms, plantation ideology, and named after the area plantation owners gave to African individuals they enslaved to grow their own food, provision ground ideology. For Wynter, these are the ideological poles between which Caribbean culture vacillates. In the essay, she reclaims oral and performance traditions of those of provision ground ideology during slavery and after emancipation for Jamaican culture, living traditions that, as her title suggests, were considered folk culture in Jamaica of 1970. For the purposes of my work as an art historian, I add visual culture to her analytical framework. Let's begin with plantation ideology. Referencing Leopold Sédar Senghor, Wynter argues that the expansion of Western civilization through colonization signaled a shift towards a fundamentally altered way of viewing nature. She writes, quote, for the European, alien to the New World, nature became land, and land, if it were to be exploited, needed not men, essentially, but so many units of labor power, end quote. It was an existential change by which, especially in the British colonies, profit became the motive for society. Plantation owners and merchants endeavored to dominate the natural environment. They enslaved Africans, who were deemed both labor and capital, to forcibly work the land to generate product. This Wynter calls plantation ideology. That is, the mode of the colonial body centered on the rights of property that, she argues, formed the basis for, quote, the superstructure of civilization in the Caribbean, end quote. Let's briefly look at two relatively characteristic visual representations of Jamaica during the colonial period that I posit are exemplary of plantation ideology. To start, here is an 1816 survey map by Benjamin Haynes of the Lucky Valley Estate, a 1,915-acre plantation owned by Edward Beeston Long, and before his father, Edward Long, author of the notorious History of Jamaica. The survey's sumptuous, colorful designs, with different shades of green signaling information concerning crop type, cacao, sugarcane, coffee, suggests it was commissioned for display rather than for strictly utilitarian purposes. More than half of the property has been labeled, quote, wood, guinea grass not fenced, Negro grounds, and ruinate, end quote. The 282 enslaved African adults and children who labored on the plantation would have lived and created culture on their provision grounds and on, in, and around their houses marked along the slope in the background of the detail at the right and outlined here in turquoise. While this survey While this survey by design explicates, to an extent, plantation operations, in contrast, James Hakewell's early 1820s print seen here does the opposite. Part of the 300 acres of sugarcane on the Williamsfield estate flutters in the breeze as it grows on either side of us. In the valley next to the bridge sits the sugar works, though less than 10 of the 304 enslaved Africans and freed people of color who labored on the estate are shown. The image has rendered natural a scene and its economic underpinnings, the slave trade and enslavement. It was published in Hakewell's A Picturesque Tour of the Island of Jamaica, which included several other tranquil prospects of plantations, likely commissioned by their owners, as well after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, debates on slavery ensued. Of course, such images were for the planter class, so they not surprisingly articulate plantation ideology. Scholars have made clear that visual representations of the British West Indies, including seemingly innocuous landscapes, were anything but neutral. Indeed, prior to emancipation, if enslaved African individuals were imaged at all, they tended to appear as workers within a benevolent order. Such images, combined with the historiography of the region, likely led writer Yankaru to pronounce in the first Caribbean Writers and Artists Convention that establishing freedom required resurrecting and burying, quote, images of the slave who had been a nameless creature, an economic entity, an anonymous extension of European civilization, end quote. My interpretation of this already paraphrased statement is that freedom requires resurrecting images and stories of enslaved adults and children in order to bury the colonial worldview and instead emphasize their humanity, culture, and kinships. While identifying images of Haynes and Hakewell as informed by, forming, and upholding plantation ideology may seem perhaps so clear it need not be stated, doing so underscores that there was another worldview, another culture, that of provision ground ideology, not only in their midst, but also integral to that which allowed their existence. They were functions of one another. Wynter's provision ground ideology presents a different way of relating to land, in which land is not instrumental for capital production, but rather earth, a site of belief, community, and ancestral memory. While for Wynter, working with the writings of Haitian scholar Jean Price Mars, the Europeans in the Americas dehumanized both man and nature, with capital letters, to accumulate capital. The African presence rehumanized nature by, quote, peopling it with gods and spirits, with demons and duppies, with all the rich panoply of man's imagination, end quote. Wynter argues that the folk culture of enslaved Africans, their religion, their lore, helped to, quote, save their own humanity against the constant onslaught of the plantation system, end quote. For Wynter, then, folk culture in Jamaica is rooted in this history. Folk culture and its provision ground ideology would morph with land and labor relations on the island as a, quote, cultural guerrilla resistance against the market economy, end quote. It would, Wynter writes, give rise to the roots of Caribbean culture. It will probably not surprise you that in my research I have come across scarce visual or material remains made by and for those representing provision ground ideology before emancipation and apprenticeship in 1834 and 1838. However, in 1970 scholarship from the region, we find what could resemble a sort of provision ground ideology lineage in the contemporary. As anthropologist Barry Chavan suggests from field research in 1975 concerning Rastafarianism, quote, the worldview of the Jamaican peasantry, the direct descendant of those who came after Columbus, the Africans forced into slavery, resonates in the Rastafari, end quote. He names it revivalism after the Afro-Jamaican revival religion, and argues that the worldview emerged out of the enslaved's determination, quote, to make the best of this new situation on their own terms, which meant resistance to European slavery and colonialism, both physical and mental, end quote. Wynter recalls that seeing Rastafarian paintings on the street in the 1960s, seeing, quote, Rastafarians creating their own imaginary, end quote, also focused her gaze on the dominant imaginary that functioned to disavow it, an imaginary opposite of plantation ideology. In 1970, she referenced Rastafarian painters, as well as the Jamaican artist Malika Capo Reynolds, who was also a revival leader, emphasizing the Afro-diasporic religious dimensions of their art. Resonating with Wynter, Brathwaite studied ancestral cultures in the present, citing Capo as well as other regional artists for whom Afro-Caribbean religion, social commentary, and art making were, in his terms, inseparable, including Ross Efrold Brown, a Jamaican artist and founder of the Assembly of the Living, and Philip Moore, a Guyanese artist deeply influenced by Afro-diasporic religions and the founder of his own religio philosophy, God-manliness. All three of these artists appeared in the expansive Carafesta constellation, including encouraged ancillary exhibitions that decade. In other words, folk culture held a strong visual as well as performance presence at the festival. Wynter's text underscores another absolutely crucial dimension of multilingual Caribbean plantation culture. It includes those cultural traditions submerged by Western epistemology, includes, that is, the cultures of provision ground ideology, as well as plantation ideology, and that pervasive ambivalence between them, all of which continued into the 1970s. Read through the combined lens of Beckford, Best, Wynter, and Brathwaite, the short phrase thus locates culture not in the metropoles of colonial Europe, but within the plantation, a location colonial logic went of economic, not cultural production. Shattering that racialized notion, the phrase encompassed an expansive regional geography, wherein cultural traditions flourished with, out of, in spite of, or against the plantation and its afterlife. Encompassed an expansive geography, that is, from which a complex Caribbean culture could rise. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that incredibly rich paper, Adrienne. I look forward to speaking with you and our entire panel later on about the notion of epistemic sovereignty and your work in thinking through this question of provision ground ideology. I think this is really something very important for us to consider as we have our conversation later on. Our next paper is by Nicole Smythe-Johnson, a writer and independent curator who was senior curator of the National Gallery of Jamaica before beginning her PhD at the University of Texas, Austin, where she is currently a PhD candidate. More recently, she was assistant curator on John Dunkley, Neither Day or Night, an exhibition of the work of the Jamaican painter at the Perez Art Museum, which was also at the National Gallery of Jamaica and at the American Folk Art Museum in New York City. And here it's very interesting also even just to think about all of the different ways in which this artist's work is framed as folk art, as national art, and as contemporary art. And Latin American art at that. She has published in Flash Art, Terremoto, Jamaica Journal, and was editor of Caribbean Quarterly, the University of West Indies' flagship culture journal. And her paper is entitled Overwriting Haitian Modernism, DeWitt Peters, Jose Gomez Sicre, and the Historiography of Renaissance.
This paper came out of a simple question that is rarely taken seriously. What makes some art primitive and some art modern? What do we mean by primitive and modern, and why do those concepts continue to enjoy such currency, even if vocabulary for referring to primitive art has ostensibly evolved to include terms like intuitive, naive, outsider, etc. I engage that question by taking a look at one formative moment in the deployment of those terms in a Caribbean context, a moment when Haitian primitive art and Cuban modern art met with lasting consequences. And then acknowledge the failure of my attempt, a failure that Wynter's work makes palpable. 2 very long years ago, just before the COVID-19 pandemic took hold in the US, I came across a set of correspondence between Cuban curator Jose Gomez Sicre and DeWitt Peters, who I'd always thought of as the founder of Lusanda Art, one of Haiti's oldest and best known art institutions in the Benson Latin American collection at the University of Texas at Austin. The discovery, that uncomfortable word is so hard to avoid, led to an obsession that has not yet waned. So now, after years of working on my Spanish accent, I'm in the market for a French tutor. All that to say, pardon my French, as I share this excerpt from a longer paper that I am still developing. When Jose Gomez Sicre arrived in Haiti in 1945, the young curator was just beginning to make a name for himself in the field of Latin American art. Over the next 30 years, he would shape the field in important ways, particularly as it is studied and exhibited in the US. By some accounts, before Gomez Sicre, there was Argentine or Mexican art, Peruvian or Venezuelan art. The phrase Latin American art belongs to Gomez Sicre, but also the ideal contained in that expression. Born in Matanzas, Cuba in 1916, Gomez Sicre trained as a lawyer at the University of Havana. Between 1940 and 1945, he established himself as a leading curator and critic traveling from his base in Cuba to Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Argentina, and Haiti to study art and curate exhibitions. It was also during this period that he solidified important international contacts, most notably with Alfred Barr, the founding director of MoMA. In 1944, he and Barr co-curated Modern Cuban Painters at MoMA, an exhibition that would play a major role in Cuban and modern art history. That exhibition positioned Cuban art alongside Mexican art at the forefront of mid-century artistic practice and secured Cuban art's position in the canon of modern art being constructed by Barr. In 1946, Gomez Sicre moved to Washington, D.C. to take up a decades-long role leading the Pan American Union's visual arts section. He developed a reputation for championing modern art, particularly abstract art, as a democratic form in keeping with US-American Cold War cultural policy. Claire Fox has a great book on this called Making Art Pan-American. American watercolorist Stuart Peters came to Haiti in 1943. As a conscientious objector, he rejected military service, opting instead to serve as an English teacher in one of many projects supported by the US State Department as part of the Good Neighbor policy. Not long after his arrival, Peters abandoned language teaching to advocate for the establishment of a school of painting in Port-au-Prince. He enjoyed impressive backing, though Peters would emerge as the face of the institution, an especially convenient circumstance under the pro-American presidency of Ely Lescott. A group of Haiti's most important artists, writers, and intellectuals who called themselves indigenists and maintained a short-lived journal called La Revue Indigène, collaborated on the development of the center. Philippe Tauby-Marcellin, Georges Ramponneau, and Antoine Derencourt, for example, were all indigenists and among Glissant's co-founders. The center was funded first by the Haitian state and later the US State Department, who offered matching funds. The earliest correspondence between Peters and Gomez Sicre in the Benson archive is a letter inviting Gomez Sicre to mount an exhibition of modern Cuban art at Le Centre d'Art, which had just secured a space. All of the artists whose work Peters asked Gomez Sicre to include in the proposed exhibition were in the Modern Cuban Painters show, with the exception of Wilfredo Lam, who was already well known internationally, which suggests that Peters had seen the MoMA show or coverage of it. The exhibition opened on January 18, 1945, with significant support from the Haitian government, who agreed to pay for the transport of artwork, as well as Gomez Sicre's trip to Haiti for the opening. In a letter dated February 3, 1945, Peters also mentions that the government recommended that all students visit the show so that we have had thousands of young people. Within days of Gomez Sicre's return to Cuba, the idea of a show of Haitian primitive art in Havana was introduced. In a letter to Gomez Sicre dated February 9th, Peters writes, "Very good reaction, it seems, to the samples of primitive art you took back. The Haitians are very pleased at the prospect of a Haitian exhibition going abroad." Interestingly, Peters consistently puts primitive in quotation marks, suggesting an ambiguity around the use of the term. When Gomez Sicre writes to his mentor Barr from Haiti, however, he is not as cautious. In encouraging Barr to buy a piece of Haitian art on behalf of MoMA, Gomez Sicre writes, "I can assure you it is a masterwork of primitive painting that would be a very spectacular item in the museum." In his February 22 letter, Peters refers to the upcoming show as one of Haitian popular painting and asks that the Cuban government pay for a qualified Haitian to attend the opening and give a short introduction to the show. In a follow-up letter on March 11, 1945, he again uses the language of popular painting and presses to have a Haitian present, even enclosing an introduction to the show written by Haitian architect and sculptor Albert Mangones, explaining that it is so well written that we hope and are sure that it will get a really good translation. To no avail, however, as Gomez Sicre's response explains that he has not been able to secure funds to support Mangones' trip, with no mention of the introduction. He also refers to the exhibition as the Haitian Primitive Show, again with no quotation marks. Glissant's inaugural exhibition indicates the organization's initial championing of trained artists from the same cultural elite that spawned the indigenous movement. The show included artists like Lucien Price, who was from a wealthy family, studied in Paris, and turned to gestural abstraction in the late 1940s. Albert Mangones, who studied in Brussels and at Cornell University in New York, was also in that first exhibition. These artists were moderns in the most conventional sense of the word. not only by virtue of their engagement with the European avant-garde, but also the circles they traveled in at home and abroad. They were part of the international set, who are generally New World Modernism's protagonists. Mangones, for example, makes an appearance in the diaries of an Ice Nin. Apparently smitten, Nin writes of meeting Mangones at a party and later visiting his studio. He could easily pass for a Spaniard or a Cuban, but he does not deny his African father. His skin is the color of coffee with much milk and a touch of gold. His mouth is full, soft, and sensuous. His hair dark and sensuous. He is gay, sincere, and natural. He looks made for pleasure, but he is planning to return to Haiti to build low-income housing. Nin's account of meeting Mangones speaks to his elite status. In an earlier passage, she tells us that he has just won a gold medal for architecture at Cornell and describes him as well-educated and refined. And his political commitments as a son of public servant and historian closely associated with the indigenous movement. Larry Hoffman, former director of the Davenport Art Gallery, has noted that Gomez Sicre's visit in 1945 was the impetus for Glissant's shift in focus towards self-taught artists. He writes, DeWitt Peters' attitude did not at first regard the discoveries as more than a passing fad. He was concerned only with the country's more sophisticated style of trained artists. In 1945, however, an art critic who had arrived in Port-au-Prince from the opening of a modern Cuban art exhibition encouraged Peters to promote and give more attention to his discoveries. Peters' use of quotation marks around the word primitive in his correspondence with Gomez Sicre may also indicate the opinions of his closest collaborators at the time. The Glissant art letterhead that Peters' letters appear on lists President, painter, Maurice Bourneau, Treasurer, painter, George Ramponneau, General Secretary, architect and sculptor, Mangones, as well as writer and 1952 Guggenheim Fellow, Philippe Tauby-Marcellin, artist and businessman, Jean Chenet, and painter, Antoine de Renancourt. So initially, Glissant was very much an artist-run space, founded to serve the needs of a relatively small and decidedly elite artistic community in Port-au-Prince. As Peters' focus shifted increasingly towards promoting self-taught artists and maintaining their purity, tensions would develop between him and his board. Eventually, they all resigned, most leaving to start Foyer des Arts Plastiques in 1950. The exit of the founding board would open the door to American connoisseur and former intelligence officer Selden Rodman's directorship. The use of the term primitive may not have sat well with Peters' early collaborators, who occupied a tenuous position as indigenists. On the one hand, the indigenists rejected the Bovaryism of the Haitian elite, critiquing the persecution of voodoo that would reach its height during the 1941 and 42 anti-superstition campaign. On the other, texts like American journalist William Seabrook's hugely popular The Magic Island took a sensationalist tone, portraying Haiti as a place of cannibalism and human sacrifice. This did not sit well with the Haitian elite, including the indigenists who were actively involved in nation building and resisting the paternalistic claims of the American occupation. The other notable thing about this series of correspondence between Peters and Gomez Sicre is the latter's failure or refusal to acknowledge the introduction to the exhibition that Mangones wrote. A copy of the introduction is not even preserved in Gomez Sicre's papers. This is a prime example of how the intellectual contributions of Haitian cultural producers and scholars have been written out of mainstream Haitian art history. Even if Gomez Sicre could not secure the funds to support Mangones' presence at the opening of the exhibition, surely a text written by a respected Haitian intellectual affiliated with Glissant and familiar with the work in the exhibition and the context from which it emerges would have been worth translating for inclusion in a catalog or pamphlet. Gomez Sicre completely overlooks the text in his response, however. The final question that emerges from an examination of this correspondence is, what makes Cuban art of this period modern and Haitian art primitive? That is to say, not modern. Several of the painters included in the Cuban modern art exhibition in Port-au-Prince had similar preoccupations as the indigenous and Glissant's self-taught painters. Cuban painter Carlos Enriquez, whose Horses and Landscape was included in the Port-au-Prince exhibition and who traveled to Haiti for the opening, is a particularly good example. His longstanding commitment to depicting the Cuban peasantry and Afro-Cuban culture is well documented. Works like Tocadores and Virgen del Cobre indicate the artist's interest in Afro-Cuban culture and tradition. Virgen del Cobre, which represents Cuba's patron saint as the Yoruba deity Oshun, with whom Our Lady of El Cobre is syncretized in Santeria, finds resonance with Hippolyte's much celebrated depiction of voodoo laws in content, if not in form. The reassessment of tradition and expression of national or regional presence in art, as well as the different approaches to the interrelated issues of modernism and nationalism that Juan Martinez argues characterized the pioneer Latin American modern art schools, also animated mid-century Haitian cultural production. The output of Haitian artists, whether Philomé Obon's tireless rendering of Haitian history, Hippolyte's well-known depictions of Haitian spiritual life and natural environment, or Pétion Savant's ceremony Vaudou, are all attempts to navigate these tensions visually. Another document in the Benson archives gives a sense of how Gomez-Sicre may have framed the exhibition in ways counter to the perspective and interests of someone like Mangones. Gomez-Sicre's papers include a typewritten 3-page history of Haitian art. Though the text is undated, it is fair to assume that it was written around the time of the exhibition of Haitian art in Havana and may have served as an introductory text. The text begins by comparing Haiti to the former Spanish colonies. Gomez-Sicre writes, contrary to the Spanish that left behind an art latent with their causes of the sword and the cross, military and religious fortresses, the French left in America an irreparable void. Therefore, the only French colony that is independent of France does not have a single stone that shows where a French hand, friar or engineer has left a trace. This conception of Haiti as having expunged its European heritage with the revolution is at odds with the accounts of the revolution by Haitian writers like Émile Bergod, who saw the revolution in Saint-Domingue as a continuation of the European Enlightenment project as manifest in the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It is also in contrast to the work of later thinkers like David Scott and Édouard Glissant, who see Haiti and other post-colonial nations as fundamentally shaped, even constituted by their encounters with European modernity. It does successfully position Haiti outside of the intellectual and cultural trajectory that is supposed to culminate in modernism. The document also overwrites the existence of the Haitian intelligentsia, many of whom studied in Europe and were culturally and intellectually oriented toward Europe. We have now come to the point where I should offer a link to Sylvia Wynter, however tentatively. I want to suggest that the story I have laid out here is essentially a story of overlapping relations between Cuban and Haitian art, between the art historical narrative of American and Cuban foreigners and that of Haitians, and the final layer between the Haitian and expatriate intelligentsia and the makers of what would come to be called primitive art. The negotiation between all of these pairs is more complex than that between Black and whiter, foreigners and locals, rich and poor. The layers of dominance/subordination that shape this story are, as Gomez-Sicre unself-consciously signals in his Haitian art history, shaped by the relation between colonizer and colonized. But what's more, the language available to me as someone trained in art history only allows me to respond with, mid-century Haitian art is also modern. But what is modern, and why should being modern matter? What is at stake in making the epithet of modern, that deeply European concept, aspirational? If I write Hippolyte as more like Carlos Enriquez or Breton, does that improve or worsen the problem? The real matter at hand is, as Wynter tells us, one of being, an accepted and a negated form of being, the latter of which Haiti continues to signify. I will end here with that gesture toward thinking beyond the limits of the discipline. We need more than to expand the canon. We need to restructure what it is possible for art history to say. Thank you.
Thank you for those words, Nicole. Absolutely crucial for our discussion later. The question of being as it relates to modernity and thinking through the questions of terminology when we're thinking about what it means for us to historicize these entangled stories. Our next paper is by Sarah Phillips Castile, with whom I co-founded the Center for Transnational Cultural Analysis at Carleton University in 2004, along with our colleague Catherine Kordock. Sarah is professor of English at Carleton University and has the distinction of being an important voice in two separate academic fields, Caribbean studies and Jewish studies. Of course, the fact that they're separate academic fields is part of the problem and part of the main purpose of her inquiry, in the sense that she seeks to bring together these two complex fields in entangled ways, as she will be doing in her paper today. Among many other publications in her long and eminent CV, she is author of Calypso Jews, Jewishness in the Caribbean Literary Imagination, and editor of Caribbean Jewish Crossings, Literary History and Creative Practice. In 2021, she held the Potsdam Postcolonial Chair in Global Modernities. Her current book project is Making History Visible, Black Victims of Nazi Persecution in Literature and Art. Sarah's paper is entitled Creolizing Holocaust Art, the Joseph Nasi Collection. Sarah?
Buried in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's storage facility in suburban Washington are a series of drawings and paintings by Joseph Nasi, a little-known Surinamese artist of African, Sephardic Jewish, and European descent. While living in Brussels in the 1940s, Nasi was arrested as an enemy alien and interned alongside a number of other Black expatriates in transit and civilian POW camps in Belgium and Germany. During his 3-year internment, Nasi created a poignant and extensive visual diary of his and his fellow prisoners' experiences. The Joseph Nasi Collection is a unique visual document of Black civilian internment. Just as singularly, it registers a Jewish Caribbean presence in the Nazi camp system, thereby revealing the interpenetration of metropolitan and colonial histories and the porousness of cultural, religious, and geographic borders. The creolized perspective on the wartime past that Nasi's art embodies is one that is absent from standard historical accounts. In this paper, I argue that Nasi's characteristically Caribbean form of creolized Jewishness has hindered the collection's recognition. In contrast to this reception history, the Nasi collection encourages a relational understanding of the Holocaust and Holocaust art. The collection recalls the deep historical presence of Sephardic Jews in colonial Suriname, where they resettled in the aftermath of their expulsion from Spain and Portugal in the late 15th century. Simultaneously, it draws attention to the interconnected racial persecution of Blacks and Jews under the Third Reich. In order to situate the collection, I'll begin by briefly establishing central biographical details of Nasi's Sephardic Caribbean family history, early life in Suriname and the United States, and internment in Nazi Germany. I'll then spotlight 3 paintings from the collection that illustrate its capacity to reorient our view of the past and to challenge a binary hierarchical understanding of metropole and periphery. Finally, I'll consider how shifting institutional and memorial frameworks have shaped the collection's exhibition history and contributed to its invisibility. Joseph Nasi was born in 1904 in the Surinamese capital Paramaribo into a middle-class family of mixed heritage. His paternal grandmother was born enslaved, while his paternal grandfather was descended from a founding figure of Suriname's Jewish community, the 17th century patroon or professional colonizer, David Cohen Nasi. It was David's son who donated the land for Joden Savannah, or the Jews' Savannah, a self-governing community of Jewish planters that reached its height in the 18th century. Behind the ruins of the Joden Savannah synagogue lie both a Jewish cemetery and a Creole cemetery. The latter contains graves of descendants of Joden Savannah's enslaved population, many of whose surnames indicate descent from or former ownership by members of the Jewish community. Indeed, historian Aviva Ben-Ur has recently demonstrated that the longevity of the Jewish community in colonial Suriname was due to its deepening contact with enslaved and free people of African descent amidst hierarchy and violence. Joseph Nasi's Sephardic surname thus marks a deep history of Jewish settler colonialism, creolization, and involvement in the plantation and slavery economies in Suriname that resulted in the emergence of a significant Euro-African Jewish population. His intricate lineage, which brings together the histories of Jewish flight to the New World and transatlantic slavery, is characteristic of the Caribbean and especially of Suriname. Also in characteristic Caribbean Jewish fashion, Nassi's family was no longer observant by the time of his birth, and yet nonetheless was, and continues to be, aware of its Jewish heritage. While readily recognizable in a Surinamese and wider Caribbean context, however, Nassi's creolized Jewishness would pose problems for his artwork's post-war reception. After spending his early years in Suriname, Nassi moved in 1918 to New York, where he attended high school and then earned a degree in electrical engineering. Much like a number of African Americans during the interwar years, Nassi eventually sought greater freedom and prospects through emigration to Europe. The opportunity came in 1929 when he was sent to England to install sound systems for the first talking movies. Before embarking for Europe, Nassi had applied for an American passport under a false place and date of birth, thereby acquiring a new American citizenship that would profoundly shape his wartime experience. After working in England and France in the 1930s, Nassi settled in Brussels, where he married a Belgian woman and studied painting at the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Paradoxically, Nassi's emancipatory migration to Europe exposed him to a different regime of racial oppression that took hold with the rise of the Third Reich. Following the German occupation of Belgium and the entry of the US into the war, Nassi was arrested as an enemy alien in April 1942. After being held in a transit camp in Belgium, he was transferred for the duration of the war to Elag 7 in Laufen, Bavaria, and its subcamp in the neighboring village of Tittmoning. The Nazi officials apparently believed him to be an American and were not aware of his Jewish lineage. While living in New York in the 1920s, Nassi would have been disadvantaged by American binary formulations of race that contrasted with Suriname's more complex system of racial classification. Now, in Nazi Germany, the similarly reductive racial assignment imposed on him once again obscured the intricacies of his creolized identity. This time, however, Nassi appears to have strategically accepted the racial assignment of Blackness, which buttressed his claim to US citizenship and protection under the Geneva Convention, thereby sparing him the much harsher treatment to which he likely would have been subjected as a Dutch citizen of African and Jewish descent. During his internment, Nassi received art supplies from the International YMCA that enabled him to produce over 200 drawings and paintings. Comprising interior and exterior scenes, as well as portraits in pencil, ink, and oil paint, the work's muted palette, bleak imagery, and stark composition convey the loneliness, anxiety, and deprivations of daily life in Nazi civilian POW camps. The psychological challenges of internment find their deepest expression in Nassi's moving portraits of his fellow prisoners. In keeping with other art created in the Nazi camp system, the genre that dominates the collection is portraiture. Somewhat atypically for internment portraiture, however, Nassi does not include any textual information identifying his subjects. His portraits are also unusual in that many of them portray Black internees, 16 of whom were imprisoned alongside him. While most were African Americans, one was a West African who had been in the British Navy. Nassi's finely rendered graphite portraits of Elag 7's Black prisoners express a quiet pathos that distinguishes them from photographs taken in the camp. Still more resonant are Nassi's oil paintings of Black internees, such as a portrait of a prisoner eating a humble meal from a bowl in the Beverloo camp in 1942. Combining portraiture with the activities of daily life, this striking work situates its subject in a camp environment signaled by the armed guard and barracks that appear through the window. In one of his most complex compositions, Nassi portrays 9 Black prisoners in their cramped barracks in Tittmoning Castle in 1943. Here, the thick application of paint and gray and brown tones generate an atmosphere of airless enclosure. In the background, one prisoner faces away from the viewer at a silent piano, while 4 others sit or lie in their bunks. In the foreground, 3 seated figures are occupied with preparing or eating food and playing the guitar. Meanwhile, a 4th stares out at the viewer. Much like the Beverloo prisoner, his raised eyebrows and direct gaze invite us to engage with and witness the scene. Head tilted to one side, right hand resting on his knee, shoulders slumped and legs splayed, he appears resigned to his fate, his passive pose conveying the despair and helplessness of his situation. In the upper left-hand corner of the canvas, we see Nassi himself at work at an easel while perched on his bunk. This embedded self-portrait signals how, as an artist, Nassi reclaimed some degree of agency and control by organizing the visual elements that make up this scene of disempowerment. Nassi's portrait of the Black tit-moaning internees communicates in a concentrated fashion possible only through a visual medium the prisoner's psychological and material predicament. The composition suggests the emotional and political relationships forged among the prisoners by the racialized conditions of their internment, which included being bunked together in a confined space. Notably, however, each of the prisoners appears lost in his own thoughts. The men do not converse, and their gazes are directed away from one another. Thus, while their spatial assembly can be read as an affirmation of group solidarity, Nassi maintains a sense of their individuality while hinting at possible fragmentation. In keeping with the genre of civic group portraiture, Nassi's composition seeks to balance the simultaneous expression of group solidarity, equality, and individuality. A double portrait that Nassi painted the following year likely depicts the African-American jazz musicians Johnny Mitchell and Henry Crowder. As in the group portrait, here Nassi presents the 2 prisoners in the austere, claustrophobic atmosphere of the medieval castle that served as their barracks. In contrast to the stiff, motionless posture characteristic of individual portraits, the men's more casual poses convey their enforced intimacy and shared identity as prisoners. Mitchell is seated on the top bunk of a bed playing the guitar, while Crowder lies on the bunk below reading, his head propped up in his left hand. Intent on their activities, the prisoners' knitted brows and heavily shadowed faces convey the psychological challenges of internment not captured by textual and photographic records of Elag 7. Nassi's internment art illustrates the power of visual media to document a hyper-visible prisoner population that nonetheless has remained hidden from view in the collective memory of World War II. Recording the particular conditions of Black civilian internment, the Nassi collection at the same time promotes a relational understanding by positioning the Black prisoners' experiences as intimately connected to those of other victim groups it depicts, including a number of Polish Jewish prisoners. Moreover, by virtue of Nassi's own Caribbean background and the colonial backgrounds of some of the other internees he portrayed, the collection reveals the interpenetration of European and colonial wartime experiences. After his liberation in May 1945, Nassi remained in Germany for a full year, unwilling to leave until he could securely transport his artworks back to Belgium. His determination to keep his collection intact likely reflected his awareness of its value as historical evidence. Yet despite his evident desire to preserve his art as an historical record, the Nassi collection has not been exhibited in over 25 years, and it's virtually unknown today. In exhibitions that were mounted in the early post-war years, before the concept of the Holocaust and the specificity of Jewish victimhood had been established, Nassi's wartime works were presented in universalist terms as prisoner art and as evidence of the triumph of the human spirit. Nassi's internment art continued to be exhibited in Brussels through the mid-1950s, after which it appears not to have been shown again until the 1980s. By this point, the Holocaust had come to be understood as a distinct event targeting a specific victim group. Accordingly, the collection now began to be promoted as Holocaust art, and Nassi's Jewish lineage became much more focal. Yet, in the 1980s and 90s, unfamiliarity with Caribbean forms of Jewishness increasingly became an obstacle to the collection's recognition. Curators came under pressure in the 1980s to verify Nasi's level of religious observance. While Nasi grew up around the corner from Paramaribo's Sephardic synagogue in a Jewish-infused milieu, however, his identity was profoundly multifaceted, displaying a religious and cultural fluidity typical of many Caribbean people who trace Jewish ancestry. The kinds of confluences between wartime Europe and the Caribbean and between African and Jewish diaspora experience that the Nasi collection registers are not captured by standard historical accounts. Instead, metropolitan and colonial histories have been compartmentalized, severed from one another. This same separative logic has shaped the reception history of the Nasi collection, conforming neither to established definitions of Holocaust art nor to a normative understanding of Jewishness. Nasi's artworks and the chapter of wartime history that they document have been consigned to invisibility. Nasi's paintings and drawings are not only passive objects onto which narrative containers are imposed by curators and scholars, however. Rather, they are counter-memorial agents that actively call on us to reshape such frameworks and reorient our view of the past. Approached from this perspective, Nasi's internment art promotes a relational understanding of the history of Nazi persecution, one that recognizes the entanglement of European and colonial spaces and memories. Thank you.
Thank you for that rich and fascinating paper, Sarah. I just love that terminology, that idea of these artworks being counter memorials, and that they have that kind of agency as artworks. And that's something that I'd like to speak about a little bit later in our conversation, alongside all of the complicated sort of refigurings that you're proposing in your paper. At this point, I would like to invite all of our panelists to join me in our virtual roundtable. Please, if you could turn on your cameras. There we go. Let's see, Adrian. Okay, good. Everyone is here. That was wonderful. Thank you all for your contributions and for the important work that you're all doing in this field and the ways in which your papers all speak to each other. And I really felt that together, through the notion of counter histories, they propose a kind of refusal of singularity and compartmentalization, and also address the ways in which creative practice offers not just case studies, but theoretical proposals for reframing even, narratives, theoretical models, and disciplinary frameworks. So, these are really important conversations for us to be having and for us to be having together. So I would like to remind our audience that if you have questions, please do put them in the question and answer box below. And as I wait for questions to be coming from the audience, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to start a conversation that picks up on Catherine McKittrick's assertion of method in her work, which is something that I see running very strongly through all of your papers. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, usually directed to one of you as a starting point, but really the questions are for all of you to jump in to answer after the first person starts the conversation. So building on this idea of method, I think the notion of epistemic sovereignty emerges very strongly in Adrian's paper as a leitmotif that is also picked up by Nicole and Sarah in different ways. And I'd like to ask you, Adrian, to start by please expanding on the significance of epistemic sovereignty that grows out of your work on provision ground ideology. And then perhaps Nicole and Sarah, you could also jump in to reflect on how that concept speaks to your work as well. It'd be really nice to see some comparative work between Nicole and Adrian, your sort of various case studies to think through different modalities of thinking through epistemic sovereignty on different islands. I'd also like you, Nicole, I'm sorry, not Nicole, Adrian, to respond to a question or sort of series of comments that we received from Helen Starr in the chat here, who talks about the creation of unique histories and sort of independent histories. As fundamentally this question of epistemic sovereignty through the idea of steel drums. And she writes, our own unique history is proof of how a generation of males born into households within the locale of the Shango yards and without musical instruments hammered steel drums over generations to produce today's steel pan. Building from the earth is often used alternatively with building from the ground up. In the processes that they created, in the process, they created a production and tuning technology that relied essentially on local imagination and domestic producer goods. This is the most obvious example of how native capacity can transform economy away from a specialized export sector. So the floor is yours.
Yes, okay, thank you very much, Ming, and thank you also to the many organizers and to Odessa especially for all of your work on this panel, and to my fellow panelists. It's really wonderful to be here with you and to learn from your work. I will answer your questions in the reverse order, if that's okay, and I do think that they are related. So thank you as well, Helen Starr, for your feedback and for sharing references. Tapia is part of this wider ecosystem of thought that I'm studying as part of my project, and I actually haven't had a chance to dive into its work much, so I really appreciate your nudge. And as Ming explained, you also draw attention to an absolutely wonderful and powerful example of local individuals and local imagination, as you say, transforming economic materials away from export into something that is vitalizing and nurturing. And so I want to first thank you for bringing the steel ban into our conversation today. And also maybe we'll ask a question to the room, to the panel. What bringing the steel ban into this conversation also says about the limitations of art history as a method, and how it's important for us to turn an eye as art historians also away from kind of the frames of reference that we are taught to work with, and how that limits our own scope, not to mention, of course, the other subject positions that we enter the field with, which also, of course, limits our own scope and bodies of knowledge. And so with this, I'll turn to epistemic sovereignty. So as I mentioned and thank you for this question, Ming, as I mentioned in the paper, many theorists within the New World Group were making an argument that the Caribbean was economically, epistemically, and culturally dependent on the colonial and neo-colonial powers along the same lines of the plantation economy, which then reached out to the United States, right? And so in response, or as part of this conversation, was an equally, if not more important, conversation about cultural sovereignty and epistemic sovereignty, as well as economic independence. And so cultural sovereignty and epistemic sovereignty are terms that have been engaged by figures like Anthony Boge, Norman Girvin, George Lamming, and George Beckford. We could also maybe add sovereignty of the imagination. And the reason that I focus on this in my own work is that at the center of all of this is the fundamental focus and commitment to look at local and regional theories and histories and epistemes, cultures, standards, ways of living, rather than imported theories from Europe or from the US, in order to understand or think about the Caribbean life, and also to address problems within the region, right? To not rely on, and this was very much part of their argument at the time, to not constantly look outward, right? But to create local conversations, and also to value and emphasize local conversations, and to prioritize them. So that's something I think is a thread throughout the papers, as you say. So I'm excited to hear what other panelists have to say about this as well.
It might make sense for Nicole to go next so that we can have some Jamaica, Guyana sort of links here.
Hi, and of course, thank you to the organizers. Before I start, so this idea of epistemic sovereignty, and I did take a peek at Shani Roper's question, which I think is really connected to this discussion. So thanks for that, Shani. I suppose working in art history, it becomes a really sort of touchy subject, because the way that we, or what's happened so far, I think, or what the tendency is to try to, there's all of this on alternative modernisms, to try to kind of figure out how art from places like the Caribbean corresponds with all of the kind of like long history of scholarship on European art, and to put it in those terms. So as I said at the end of my paper, my initial tendency was to say, oh, well, Haitian art in the mid-20th century was also modern. Why don't we acknowledge the way that Haitian art is modern? But then as I've developed the paper, thinking to myself, well, what are the stakes of that move to make Haitian art modern? And I think that this is this issue of epistemic sovereignty. Like, what other ways are there to know art and talk about art that doesn't try to fit art from the Caribbean into these kinds of like preset and imported categories? Now, for your question, Shani, what other terms might do you not want me to address that, Ming?
No, it's fine, but I think maybe we should just read out the question so that the audience can hear what you're responding to. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, sure. So Shani says, for Nicole, you argue for a reframing of terms used to define Caribbean art. What periodizations/terms would you use to define Caribbean art that are not tied to European conceptualizations that define art? My response is, it's a work in progress. But also, I'm not sure that, and maybe, but I'm not sure that I want to propose new terms. I think that right now what I'm really interested, yes, I agree, colonized terms. I think right now what I'm really interested in doing is acknowledging the terms that exist and thinking about where they come from and what their implications are as a kind of first step. But I think the kind of drive to name in the way that art history has done historically also comes from a certain thinking place that I don't know that I want to reproduce. So here, thinking about Glissant, right, and opacity, other forms of existence. So right now, I'm thinking about where these terms come from and what debt they carry and what that tells us about how we currently think. And then sort of pushing myself to think in new ways, which may also mean rethinking the need for these kinds of like naming gestures at all. That's where I am at with it. I work on John Dunkley for my dissertation. So these kinds of questions are a big part of what I do, but I find that renaming or coming up with new names, for example, Outliers that came out of that National Gallery of Art in the US exhibition, I don't think is that helpful. It kind of reproduces the same problems. So I'm trying to find a way around that. And this paper is kind of demonstrating my grappling with that problem, which I think has some benefits. So that's my input. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And actually, I was really struck when I was reading your CV and looking at the places where the John Dunkley exhibition traveled, that he was framed in, I imagine, in very different ways in each of these very different institutions, and that epistemologically it functioned in different ways in different spaces. And perhaps the answer is that we don't have to come up with a unitary kind of terminology that fixes, but perhaps there is a possibility of being multiple and plural in these ways of reading. I don't know what you think of that as a possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the work that I've started to do around artists like John Dunkley and thinking about the sound of art is exactly engaged with these questions. So the thing that I think is interesting about Dunkley is all the different ways that he occurs and how he functions in all these different spaces, and then trying to think about how Dunkley himself, through his artwork, how he was articulating himself, kind of trying to ask that question, and whether that rubs up against all these different ways that he's been named, whether they're in line with or he's countering all those different ways that he's been named. And I think that in the case of Haitian art, I think that some of the same questions are at play. Something that I'm exploring is the ways that the way that the Jamaican art canon was developed was kind of looking at Haiti, is an idea that I'm sort of playing with and coming to, finding some evidence for. So I think that these two places are very much in conversation around these specific issues, around this matter of functioning in all these different ways, because how the Haitian intellectual class was thinking about this so-called primitive art was very different from how Dewitt Peters, Selden Rodman was thinking about it, how Breton was thinking about it, how these artists were thinking about themselves and what they were doing. And so how these different worldviews kind of rub up against each other, I think is this really productive place to think.
Absolutely. And as Shani Roper has added into the conversation, I appreciate that. And the critical engagement with context is important, right? That, you know, we are looking at these different worldviews and framings. So Helen Starr also says, thank you, Nicole. Wynter deals with this in her concept of stepping onto the demonic grounds beyond Miranda. So I don't know if you want to take 2 seconds to respond to this before I hand the floor over to Sarah.
No, I think I will just have to return to that text. But thank you for the recommendation.
Okay, sounds like we have, it's so wonderful to feel our audience members in the room through the chat. So please do, if you have comments, please add them into the chat, or if you have questions, please add them into the Q&A. We really want to involve as many of you in this conversation if possible, even though we are so far away and yet so close. So Sarah, would you like to address the question of epistemic sovereignty? Or perhaps if you wanted, we could start thinking about terminologies and frameworks, which
or maybe I can
to think about.
Yeah, I could speak to both perhaps. I really, well, first of all, thank you, Ming. Thank you to the organizers so much for this, making this wonderful conversation possible, making space for it. And I really appreciate also my co-panelists' papers, which are helping me a lot to think about the kinds of problems that I've been trying to work through. Some of the formulations you've offered, Adrian, when we were talking about the limitations of art history as method, and Nicole, what it's possible for art history to say, and what you were just saying now about not, the drive to name and resisting that that idea of fixing is something I've been thinking about a lot as well, in trying to understand why the Nazi collection has been so neglected and so invisible. And I guess and I should say, first of all, I'm not an art historian by training. So I guess in terms of what it's possible for art history to say, that maybe that liberates me a little bit, because I'm kind of an interloper, as Ming knows. So maybe I'm, in a sense, I don't know what I'm supposed to say or not say, and that maybe that's helpful. But I guess the kinds of blockages that I have been more conscious of are what the critic Brian Chayette refers to as disciplinary thinking, these separations that we create among disciplines in terms of the way that these disciplines were formed. And particularly for my work and for my work on the Nazi collection, the separation of Holocaust studies and Black studies, for example, means that a body of artworks like his becomes invisible. And I think not only invisible, but also on a sort of deeper level, also inconceivable. This is something I mentioned to the panelists in our little pre-meeting yesterday that I've been thinking about. Is it's not just that they're hidden from view, that they're out in the suburbs in the storage facility and very difficult to access and not on display, but there's something more profound about it, I think. And when I look at the history, the reception history of the collection, which has to do with a sense that Black history and Caribbean history are not part of the story of the war, and therefore this collection can't speak to that history, can't be registered. So that's something that really strikes me, especially looking, in terms of this question of terminology and frameworks. One of the things I've realized looking at the reception history of the exhibition, exhibition history of the collection, is that in the early post-war period, the Nazi works are displayable because there are different frameworks operating at that time. Prisoner art, for example, where his works are displayed alongside works by artists from Auschwitz and other concentration camps, and that's not a problem at that time. They're grouping together all prisoner art under one category. Later on, when this concept of Holocaust art starts to be formulated, that's when the issues really arise, I think, for the Nazi collection, and this problem of, does it qualify as Holocaust art, and does he qualify as Jewish, becomes part of the issue. And that's what I tried to speak to in my paper, this sort of sense that iterations of Jewishness in the Caribbean were not legible to curators and scholars trying to engage with the collection in North America and Europe. I think they really didn't have a familiarity with a context like Suriname's, and that became a real challenge for the collection's recognition. So that drive to name, that drive to, to see, does it fit into this category or not? I'm not really interested in trying to make a determination about whether this collection is Holocaust art or isn't Holocaust art. I'm more interested in, I think, as sort of to echo Nicole, how those terms have interfered with or made it difficult for this collection to come into public awareness, and therefore that our collective memory of the war also excludes the experience of Black prisoners, which this collection documents. So there are kind of multiple exclusions that come into play in that sense. So I hope that speaks to both the epistemic and the question of categories.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it also brings up the question, one question that we were all sort of thinking about earlier about decolonizing fields and frameworks, which I'd like to talk about in a little while. We do have another question for you, Sarah, that I think connects to what you were saying. So I'd like to just bring that up. It's by Kay Applewhite. Thank you for your presentation. Does Dr. Casteel know how Joseph Nassi's work has been received within Caribbean countries, or if it has been at all? Or more broadly, how does his work enlarge any definition of Caribbean art?
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a really important one. When I was in Suriname, my understanding from speaking to people there is that his work is not known there. However, the Anne Frank House did a traveling exhibition and that was on display in Paramaribo, but just before the pandemic started, so it closed prematurely, unfortunately, and they did highlight Nassi in that exhibition. So that was 2020, so it was fairly recent. But no, I don't think his work is known there, unfortunately, perhaps partly because a lot of it remained in Europe or moved to Washington when the collection was donated there. So I would be really interested in, how the works might be received there. And actually, when I was at the National Archives in Paramaribo, and was speaking to them about that, they sounded very interested in the idea of bringing his work there. So I would hope that there would be a very different perhaps context there for looking at these works. But as far as I know, there hasn't been any reception history so far. And I suppose that the other thing I could add is in terms of thinking about Caribbean art, the other, I think Nassi's work, on the one hand, it challenges the field of Holocaust studies to consider the experiences of Caribbean victims of Nazi persecution, of Black victims. But on the other hand, it may also challenge Caribbean studies to think about the place of Jewishness in the matrix of Caribbean creolization as well, and Caribbean art, and how that that might be part of the story that can be told about Caribbean art. So I see it as moving in both directions.
So that's an excellent segue to Shani Roper's question to you, Sarah, which is that she wants to know how Jewishness is read in Suriname, especially as it relates to the art.
How Jewishness is read in Suriname. I mean, I think that it is so much a presence in Suriname. If you've been there, in the language and the food and the landscape, the synagogue, the historic synagogues there. There's the saying in Suriname, shake a family tree and a Jew falls out. Cynthia McLeod's novel, The Cost of Sugar, which tells the story of Yoden Savannah and the Jewish planters. It's, I think, pervasive as part of this incredible, mix of different cultural influences in Suriname. And I think that's been something that's been quite challenging for North American Jews in particular to confront, because Suriname is the place where Jews, unlike in other parts of the Caribbean, really do own plantations and wield that kind of power, and are not just merchants and traders. And so that's a very difficult history to confront, that really, for Jews, that really challenges narratives of Jewish victimization. So the contradictions of Jewish experience in Suriname, which run from flight from the Inquisition to resettle in Suriname and become part of this white power structure and take up the privileges of whiteness. And then at the sort of other end of this story that Nassi's life also captures, you have Jewish refugees from the Nazis also arriving in Suriname and finding safe haven there and in other parts of the Caribbean. But again, being able to take up the privileges of whiteness, even as they've been racialized in Nazi Europe. So the contradictions are really powerful and in a way also challenging to grapple with. But Nassi fascinates me because he really draws attention to and highlights these very intricate, complex histories and confluences.
So Sheila Camarotti just said, this is a very important point that you just made, Sarah. Just the idea that whiteness is itself shifting, racialization is itself something that is constantly redefined from one place to another. And Kay Applewaite says, super interesting. Thank you for your response. So, I do think that we won't be able to finish on time here. We have a number of other questions that I think we would like to address as a group, and also from the audience here. If you all have an extra 15 minutes, is it okay with you if we continue? Yeah, okay. And for those of you in the audience, we'll continue taking questions and comments. This is a really lovely kind of convivial environment, and I thank you all for that. I think it's important for us to also be thinking, there's also, I should read out Shani Roper's comment here. Jews in Caribbean history were strong supporters of the slave trade and hold resources in the post-emancipation period and become absorbed into the narratives of whiteness in the Caribbean, just to sort of amplify what you were saying, Sarah. I think actually this discussion of Jewishness will probably open up some questions about the entanglements of different populations, including indentured labor in the Caribbean. And I know that both Adrian and Nicole wanted to address these questions in this discussion. So maybe I'll start with Adrian. Can you sort of address some of the questions that you ask in your dissertation that you didn't have a chance to ask in your paper?
Yes, yes, thank you for giving me the chance to expand a bit on this. So for those who know Carafesta, often one of the first things that comes to mind, well, if people know Carafesta historically and not in its ongoing only iterations, is that the inaugural iteration of the festival was boycotted by many Indo-Guyanese cultural leaders and intellectuals and community. And this is because it was in a moment of Guyanese politics. Well, it was at a moment, which has not actually ended, during which Guyanese politics and racial tensions were firmly entwined. There is an enormous Indo-Guyanese population, for those that don't know, as well as Afro-Guyanese population. The Indo-Guyanese population arrived via indentured labor, which was instated after emancipation. And so this is actually an issue that I think through in my dissertation quite a bit in relation to Carafesta, and think through how Carafesta was or was not grappling with some of these questions. And indeed, one critic said that the failures of Carafesta, that the Caribbean would be wise to learn from the failures of Carafesta for those who it left out. This is of the inaugural iteration. But the issue of indentured labor and its place within Caribbean history that is so crucial also makes me want to turn to another conversation that we had yesterday in our small group meeting about the place of Guyana and Suriname within the frame of Caribbean art history. Having that conversation yesterday drew my mind to a quotation by a Surinamese poet named R. Dobru, who wasn't invited to, well, no one from Suriname was invited to the 1970 Artists and Writers Convention in Georgetown, which was initiated by Forbes Burnham. No one from outside of the Anglophone Caribbean world was, as far as I know, and as far as my research has shown, though if anyone can contest me, please do. But Dobru said to a group of the delegates, kind of trying to argue that Suriname should be present in this conversation. You mustn't let the Caribbean fool you with where its waters stop. And I think that that's such a beautiful way of phrasing it. And I'll actually quote him if that's okay. And he blames Christopher Columbus for this misrepresentation and continues, Suriname is Caribbean, even though everyone knows it's the Atlantic on one side of us and Latin America on the other side. It's like Guyana, Caribbean, and that's it. My people and your people are the same people. Ask Columbus, ask Europeans, ask all of them who are in our countries, and they are still with us. They're in the sugar and the bauxite. Ask them, and if they tell you lies, then go to Africa and ask our people there. They know. And he does not mention indentured laborers, which of course is the descendants of indentured laborers is of course a very large population in Suriname. He also doesn't mention First Nations or indigenous people, also very large populations that are continue to be dispossessed in both of these locations. But drawing the eye to the mainland, not only to the island, is so important also because it opens up these conversations about the complexity of the region, about the multiple layers of oppression instated through the colonial period, as well as the multiple ways of resistance to that oppression, grounded in many different cultural traditions that were transplanted, but also that emerged So thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, there's a really, Helen Starr says, very important what Adrienne is saying. And so thank you so much for bringing that out for us. Nicole?
So as I was listening to Adrienne, well, first I was struck when I met all the panelists yesterday by kind of being in this conversation where Suriname and Guyana were such a big part of a conversation on Caribbean art history, because it's quite unusual. I mentioned that when I went to Suriname for research a couple of years ago, and I called my Jamaican bank, they thought Suriname was in Trinidad. So, so this is a real problem on many levels. So it's really wonderful for me to be in conversation with these two scholars looking at these places. But the other thing that I was thinking about as I was listening to Adrienne is, yeah, this matter of how thinking about the Caribbean and this idea of the Caribbean as method rather than as place that you mentioned at the beginning, Ming, allows us to sort of conceive of this hemisphere in a completely different way. So for example, one of the things that I spent some time talking about in the longer paper that this kind of little bit is drawn from is the relationship between La Revue Indigène and Indigenismo in Latin America, and how the in the journal they reference indigenismo, right? And so are really thinking about themselves in conversation with Latin America, with Mexican art at the time. And then, you also have a whole strain of Peruvian indigenismo. And so there's this real breadth, right? And also in thinking about Dunkley, I'm thinking about a period when, Dunkley is believed to have traveled to Central and South America to work on infrastructure projects like the Panama Canal, banana plantations, and so on. And so a big part of my thinking about the Caribbean, about Caribbean art in the period that I'm interested in, is how the Caribbean kind of connects all these different spaces. And Suriname and Guyana are definitely particular in bringing together all of these different, Paramaribo is just a crazy place with all this different architecture and food and languages. Both of these places are kind of important pinpoints of the Caribbean's potential to reach and to show the overlap between all of these different places in this hemisphere, but then also, of course, more broadly. So I think, I think that this is a really important part of how we think about the region, even though, earlier it was like, how does this change the definition of Caribbean art? I'm not so excited about definitions of Caribbean art. I don't think we need to do that, but this is definitely one of the kind of key factors that you have to take into consideration in any attempt to think with or about the Caribbean.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that really wonderful answer, Nicole. And, it really dovetails with what Billy Summers has written here in the chat. He says, it is interesting to consider ideas of authenticity regarding the descendants of the indentured laborers. Many people who are non-Black Caribbean are seen as outsiders or inauthentic. And I think that really sort of amplifies what all the three of you have been talking about in terms of complicating those histories, providing these counter narratives so that we can, in some ways, change the ways that we think about the Caribbean and these entangled histories. At some point, we had been talking about wanting to address this question of decolonizing frames and fields and frameworks. Is this something that you would still like to take on right now? Nicole, you were just saying that you're not interested in sort of redefining Caribbean art history at this point, but perhaps you are.
Well, I mean, I think that decolonizing terms doesn't necessarily have to mean proposing new terms, right? I don't think that those things are necessarily connected. I mean, and when I said that I'm not interested in defining Caribbean art, I mean, we wouldn't have a conversation about defining European art, right? That would be, it would be
I think we should. I really think we should. I think it's very important to complicate European art, actually.
Well,
why is French art French when so many of the people who were practicing in Paris come from all over the world? Why do we think of Parisian art as French?
Well, I mean, in that I have never thought of defining European art. It's just kind of, I'm very much, there's this kind of art, and then there's like Jamaican art and Caribbean art and Indian art and Asian art. All of this exists on the outside. No, I think that your approach means to say that, okay, we can also define European art. And that's one way to go about it, to kind of complicate, provincializing Europe and all of that. That's absolutely one way to go. I suppose a way that I'm thinking about it is to stop trying to define Caribbean art as one thing as well, and let it be just like complex and messy and not require that kind of justification. I think part of what happens, and on this topic of authenticity, part of why Albert Mangones is not the one that we think of when we think of Haitian art is because there's this idea of what Haitian art should be, and somebody as complex as Mangones cannot fit there. I think this also connects to what Sarah talks about, that because there's this kind of like closed trap of what we think Caribbean art should be, a lot of the like richness and complexity of it is lost. So I guess I'm thinking of it from that opposite angle, but I think that you absolutely have a point, Ming. I just don't spend enough time with European art to have challenged myself to do that.
No, fair enough. I wonder if Sarah and Adrian would like to say a few things about decolonizing fields and frameworks. Adrian, you were talking earlier about what does it mean for us to talk about steel drums in relation to art history?
Yes. Yes. Well, this I think I'll leave in the air, because I think that it's a really important question that I didn't bring to the table, of course, that Helen Starr brought to the table, or offered for the table, I guess. And in terms of decolonizing, I think, so I struggle a bit with the term because I have thought of Carafesta, which emerged during the independence era in the 20th century Caribbean, as a decolonizing praxis. And I have a logic for that, which is that at the time, decolonizing, and this is an argument of Anthony Boge, building on Frantz Fanon, that decolonizing was not straightforward, that there were those particularly government actors in Boge's terms that were interested in seizing the tools of colonial power, but not changing them. So those tools include, government offices, pageantry, culture, epistemology, right? All of these various things that make up the project of colonization. But then on the other hand, and Boge numbers the New World Group and Lloyd Best among this other hand, were those that were trying to rupture and break these systems. And so I think that Carafesta was both at the same time. It was a project that was Forbes Burnham, a very controversial, rightly so, political figure in Guyana, is given credit for kind of dreaming up Carafesta. I actually put the dreaming up of what the festival became within the artists and writers themselves. I don't really see I think there are a lot of limitations in thinking of it through the lens of government or government only, although of course this is a part of it. And so I think that it's highly possible to make an argument that Carafesta was kind of this two-pronged decolonization process, right? There were intentions on both levels, right? To seize the power, the tools, and to rupture the tools. But when you simply say decolonizing, especially today, because of the resurgence of the term, which is of course grounded in particular histories, people have a really particular idea of what this means, right? And so I struggle a bit with the term, and I also think that this kind of two-pronged process might be happening today as well, right? And so I think if we were to engaging this term within the context of Caribbean art or within the context of art history, I think it's really important to keep in mind the different potentials, the different uses that this term implies and has implied historically.
I am very interested in this idea of decolonizing frameworks, and particularly decolonizing Holocaust studies is something I've been thinking about. There is a move in Holocaust studies, sometimes referred to as a colonial turn, but something that I'm noticing in that work is still a failure to, I think what Wayne Modest yesterday referred to as to really challenge this division of West and non-West that seems to still be so firmly in place. And I was thinking, in Nicole's paper about the discussion that you had of expatriate artists who are, training in Europe and operating in Europe. And in the work that I've been doing, and I know Ming's work also so much, looks at this, I'm coming across lots of examples of these sort of encounters in Europe of these expatriate communities and how much of a presence they are. There's a wonderful novel by a Haitian writer, Louis-Philippe d'Alembert, called Avant que les ombres s'effacent, that portrays the Haitian expatriate community in Paris. And it's actually a novel about a Polish Jewish refugee fleeing to Haiti during the war, but he meets this Haitian emigre intellectual community. So how we could really further disrupt that idea of the separateness of these spaces, to me, is part of how that decolonization can unfold. And just to give one other example of this, there's this, I'm sure familiar to Caribbeanist, famous encounter between André Breton and Aimé Césaire in 1941 in Martinique. People know this as, from the literary history, the cultural history. That ship that brings André Breton to Martinique from Marseille, they're fleeing the Nazis, right? And on that ship are Lévi-Strauss and Anna Zegers and these various European intellectuals and so forth, but also, as you may know, Wilfredo Lam is on that same ship as well. And I'm really struck by that, looking at photographs of the passengers on board that ship and seeing Lam among them. Really, to me, illustrates that this is not a matter of, just European refugees arriving in the Caribbean, in the wartime Caribbean, but it's also about this Caribbean presence in Europe, and then a return in Lam's case. So I guess that's, for me, that's partly how I'm trying to work through this idea of decolonizing fields, is by teasing out these entanglements that have somehow been obscured, I think, in the way that we narrate these histories as separate, as compartmentalized.
Absolutely. Well, we've run out of time several times already. I think we could probably go on for hours like this. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to those of you who are in the audience for your wonderful questions and your comments. It has just felt like an incredibly relational and engaged conversation with all of you. So I think we should just take a couple of minutes to have a break. And the next panel starts at 5:30 in London. So whatever time that is for you, in about 12 minutes. And we will see you again for the next panel. Thank you again.